Good morning. I'm glad that all of you could join us. I'm Wendy Finn, the Executive Director for Chevy Chase At Home. We're really pleased to sponsor this program in partnership with Bradley Hills Village. We work with Kate Smith, the Executive Director, in planning the session. We collected questions for all of you in advance, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible. Given the timing, we may not be able to take live questions today. We've set you to mute so that everyone can hear the conversation with Fiona Hill more clearly. I'm going to turn it over to Linda Kaplan, President of Chevy Chase At Home, to tell you more about today's program.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. I appreciate that. And we are delighted to have Fiona Hill join us this morning. We have lots of questions for her and lots of questions from the audience that we got in advance. We will not be taking any questions during the session. But I am also want to introduce my colleague, Caryn McTighe Musil, who's the membership chair for Bradley Hills Village. This is a joint session between Chevy Chase At Home and Bradley Hills Village, and we are delighted to be working collaboratively. And in addition, we have, you may see, I don't know how many of you can see all of us here or how many people you can see, but we have Kate Smith, who is the director of Bradley Hills Village, and you just heard from Wendy Finn, the executive director of Chevy Chase At Home. And we have one other staff person who I want to acknowledge, and that's Catherine Cosin, who has been the person who puts together our special programming. So we thank them all. Just so you know, we're going to have a set of questions for Fiona that Caryn and I will be asking her for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to ask the questions that we received in advance from participants. I'm going to just give you a brief summary of Fiona's background, because obviously this could take half of our session if we read her entire bio. But Fiona Hill is now a senior fellow at the Center on United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She recently served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, which I urge you all to buy because it is really a very insightful read, and we think that it's definitely worth your time and effort. She's also the co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which was published by Brookings in 2015. Prior to joining Brookings, she was the Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation. She also held a number of other positions at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She's done extensive publishing and research on Russia and on Putin, and she was the author with Clifford Gaddy of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which was published by Brookings. She holds a master's in Soviet Studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. And she also holds a master's in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland. So with no further ado, we would like to welcome Fiona and welcome all of you. The way we're going to do this is Caryn and I will be sort of co-sharing the questions, and I will start and then Caryn will take over. And we, hope that this is enjoyable for all of you and certainly for Fiona. So I'll start with the question first. And you grew up in the Rust Belt, what I call the Rust Belt of Britain, in a working class family. And as you described in your book, you faced numerous barriers as you pursued your goals to advance your education and to heed your father's warning, there's nothing for you here. what were the things that helped you overcome the rigid British class structure, impact of geography, which you talk about in the book quite often, and the attendance at what we call here in the US public schools instead of what we would call private schools? So we just would love to hear from you on that.
Well, thanks very much, Linda. And first of all, it's just really great to see everybody here. I've actually got it up on gallery view, so I can, see as many people who've got their pictures up. And thanks very much. You're all my neighbours. I'm in between Chevy Chase and Bradley Hills in Bethesda, just off Old Georgetown Road. So maybe I see some of you guys while I'm out walking the dog in the morning. Anyway, it's really nice to be here. And also Linda, in particular, is an old friend. I actually used to work for her husband, Steve, when I was at the National Intelligence Council. So that was another of my many jobs. So it's really very nice to be doing this with Linda and with everyone else too. And yes, indeed, I started off in the Rust Belt of the United Kingdom, very similar area growing up to the Appalachia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania coal country. In fact, my father wanted to emigrate to Pennsylvania back in the day in the 1960s when the coal mines in our area started to close down. And one of the linkages that I wanted to make, because I know that these issues are going to be uppermost on people's mind, is that my area in northern England in County Durham has been twinned with the Donbass in Ukraine, the place that's the focus, obviously, of all the fighting right now in the war in Ukraine, going back to the 1920s in particular, but actually earlier into the 1880s and 1890s. When the Donbass was being developed, it was a very similar area to northern England. And many of the same industrialists who opened up coal mines and steelworks in northern England went off and did the same thing in Donbass. In fact, Donetsk, the city that's very much the focal point of fighting right now, used to be known as Hughesovka, after a Mr. Hughes, a North Wales industrialist, had also done some work in Britain, who went and built up the first big steelworks that we know of now in and around the Donbass. And in the 1920s, coal miners from County Durham went on a series of trips to Donbass to see what the new state-of-the-art Soviet coal mines were like, and to see if they could get any ideas for themselves. So they actually came back after a period of time quite disillusioned with what they saw developing there in the Soviet Union. And one of the reasons that I managed to move out of northern England was through education. And one of the small grants that I got to actually study Russian beginning in 1984 came from the miners of Donbass, from money that was collected by the miners' union there during the massive strike in the United Kingdom by the national mine workers, 1984 to 1985. And I had decided to go to study Russian because of what was going on in larger geopolitical affairs. This was the period of the Euro missile crisis, the stationing of the SS-20 and Pershing missiles in Europe, the whole crisis, sort of standoff over European nuclear security that extended from 1977 to 1987. So the whole period of my sort of early teens all the way through to going to college. And in the 1983, there was a major war scare. And when it actually, the United, and I learned when I was working with Steve, the Kaplan at the National Intelligence Council, this war scare had been real. There was actually whole archives that were just being opened up about this at the time, when the Soviets had completely misread the intent of some exercises the United States had engaged in, and actually thought that the United States might be preparing for a first nuclear strike. They all went on alert, and the tension was palpable in Europe at the time, and we were pretty convinced that we were going to be the site of a nuclear exchange, just as of course we're talking about now in the context of Putin and war in Ukraine. And I myself thought, well, what could I do about this? Maybe I could go and study Russian. And one of my great uncles, who had fought in World War II in the Merchant Marine and had been on the convoys supplying the Soviet Union during the war, urged my father to have me think about going to study Russian, and said that there were some grants available for children of former coal miners, and some of this money had been raised by the miners of the Donbass. And I got a very small grant to go to study Russian from scratch for a summer program before going to university in that fateful year of 1984. So there's all kinds of strange patterns. But the bottom line was, growing up in one of these deindustrialized areas, seeing all of the dislocation and the crises, a massive unemployment. 90% of British youth were unemployed when I was leaving school in 1984. This is the whole period of rapid privatization under Margaret Thatcher of the previously nationalized industries that dominated my region. And one way to overcome this was through education. And so I was the beneficiary of so many grants, from small ones like the one I just described to larger grants and fellowships. And I came to the United States in 1989 on a scholarship to Harvard that had been funded by Frank Knox, the World War II Secretary of the Navy. So I'm very much the product of education and educational opportunities. I know that many people here on this Zoom are as well.
Thank you.
That's fascinating, and the comparisons. I think that's one of the most interesting things of your book is how you end up comparing what's happening in the U.S. with what's happening in Britain and in Russia, and now Ukraine. I wanted to move to your chapter called A Divided House, where you offer one of these comparisons between County Durham, deindustrialized Lehigh Valley, where there are 12 universities. It's very interesting to watch what they're doing in Pennsylvania, and small, once viable rural Russian towns, many of which are in Siberia, but other places. And you talk about how these three different nations shared similar economic challenges. They ended up opting for similar policy decisions at that time for what to do in the face of industrialization. And that had an effect on what you call infrastructures of opportunity. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the comparisons and the kind of policy decisions that were made in that period. You're hinting a little bit what Thatcher did to your own, and how that might have led to the populism we're dealing with today.
Yes, I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, I know, to a lot of people, because of course there's some pretty steep different structures, obviously political and cultural history among the three countries. Though the UK and the United States have a lot of similarities, we're also very different in our social structures. And obviously, I mean, the United Kingdom itself is such a small country in comparison, with the United States, despite being that old imperial centre. But at the same time, in the old industrial areas of the United Kingdom, the United States and Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, there's a surprising amount of similarity. And I would say that, in many respects, I was attuned to that, having grown up in one of those areas in the United Kingdom, and I probably wouldn't have noticed it had I not come from somewhere like the Northeast, from the background that I did, with my father being a former coal miner. So just to put this into quick perspective, is that, as I just mentioned in passing to the first question, the north of England was dominated by nationalised industry. So after World War II, Britain's economy was devastated by having been cut off for 5 years of the war from international commerce. And all of the private owners found it virtually impossible, without state assistance, to basically revitalise the major manufacturing, because everything had been diverted toward the war effort, similar as it had, of course, been in the Midwest in the United States in manufacturing centres as well. But the United States wasn't cut off, if you recall, in that period. I mean, it wasn't under a kind of a blockade in the way that the UK was. And of course, most of Europe was totally devastated and had to basically embark on the Marshall Plan with the US assistance. And as the state stepped in, eventually the state took over these industries. And most of the heavy manufacturing was centred in the northeast of England, where I was, the Midlands, places like parts of Wales and Scotland, big cities like Glasgow, which had been the heartland of the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, when you think about it in the United States, the Midwest was very much the same kind of profile. The big auto manufacturing, steelworks, coal mines, everything all tied together, dating back to the late 19th century and all the way through the earlier 20th century. And so when I was growing up, there wasn't really anybody I knew that was in the private sector, because it was British coal, British steel, British rail, British shipbuilding. And so everybody worked for the state. And so as a result of that, after World War II as well, you developed the National Health Service. And if people lost their job in manufacturing or in the coal mines, as my dad did, often the only other place to work was for the National Health Service. My dad ended up becoming a porter in the hospital, an orderly, because he didn't have any qualifications other than to work in the mines, where he'd started at 14. And when I got to the Soviet Union, everything was nationalized. Of course it was. This was a state dominated, and immediately it was very familiar to me. And in all of the big enterprises there, the manufacturing plants, the coal mines, steelworks, everything was tied to that place of work. The health care was tied to it. There was clinics were just for the works. So although you kind of don't properly process it, there wasn't a national health service writ large in the Soviet Union. That was state-owned healthcare, but it was tied to the place of work. And so if those places of work closed down, those clinics closed as well. And so all of the other amenities, the social clubs, sporting clubs, everything that you thought about was tied to those big industries. And so in the 1990s, in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they embarked on shock therapy, which was a mass privatization of the state sector, you got sudden unemployment and the disruption of all of these big manufacturing centres that had all the bit of the fabric, the social fabric tied into them as well. And that had happened in the UK in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher came in and, quite rightly started to privatise the industry, but it was the speed in which this occurred, because in many of the industries hadn't really recovered from the war. They hadn't become profitable. They'd been still propped up by the state, and those that had, they were all obviously tied to kind of a much larger system. And when one bit basically fell apart, pretty much the whole sector started to unravel as well, which is exactly what I saw in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. And then what was striking to me was coming to the United States in 1989, and of course I come to Harvard on a graduate fellowship. Harvard, of course, no offense meant to Yale and Princeton and anybody else who's on here from different universities, have this pretty glowing reputation from being in the United Kingdom. And so I got what I expected when I was in Harvard Yard. But when I stepped outside of the university into the surrounding area, including Cambridge itself, East Cambridge, suburbs like Alston and Somerville and Medford, where Tufts University is. These are all the old manufacturing centres around Boston. And all the places were closing down, and it looked just like home. In fact, it looked just like the Soviet Union, where I'd just been as well. People who'd had jobs in meatpacking plants, brickworks and auto manufacturers, a lot of them were immigrants from places like Portugal or Italy or Ireland, and they'd bought all of these huge homes, wooden triple deckers for all of their families, multi-families. We were living in these, and by the time I came along, people were really pretty hard pressed, and they were renting out rooms to students basically to make ends meet. And I was very struck by how similar the problems were that I saw there, and the discontent that was starting to rise. And so over time, I started to track all of this. I first of all became very interested in the Russian context. In fact, the very first book I wrote in the early 2000s, again with my colleague Clifford Gaddy, who I co-wrote Mr. Putin with. He's an economist and looked at industrial economics, particularly in heavy industry. And we started to look at the way that the industrial transformation in places like Siberia, incredibly far-flung, huge distances, were producing an incredible drag on the Russian economy, and was one of the reasons why it wasn't really kind of bouncing along as the way that people anticipated after privatization in the 1990s. And started to see the same patterns in the old industrial areas of the US, because we started to do comparisons. And I was really struck by how all the old industrial areas, and you could have transferred this to Europe as well, of the United States, the United Kingdom, you could probably say the same, certainly about East Germany and parts of Germany and France and elsewhere, were undergoing the same dislocations as patterns in the economy changed. And you were getting people being left behind, because all of the innovation, the centers of investment, were going to certain cities. In Russia, it was Moscow, and to some degree St. Petersburg. Moscow, like Paris in France, became the concentration of all basically innovation and new service and other smaller manufacturing centres. Same happened in the UK with London and the southern area around it. And of course, here in the United States, it was a bit more diverse, because the United States economy is much more complex than all of these other economies, but it was certainly more confined to certain cities than others. And in the case of Boston, it bounced back, but many of the other manufacturing centres of Massachusetts did not. And then we got course, we got the development of what we now call the Rust Belt, which used to be the heartland. And over that whole period from the 1980s onwards, we started to see that many of places in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and elsewhere started to get left behind. And that eventually had political consequences.
That's, yeah. I was going to follow up a little about on that, but the whole issue of income inequalities, the urban-rural divide, the lack of access to other resources. You know, we have these large cities or areas around the large cities that everybody seems to, well, most, not everybody, but people seem to be doing okay. But then the rest of the country is lagging, or there's certainly large areas. And you know, how does that lead to the rise of populism? And I guess my other question that I'm going to tie to that, so it's just one sort of, is then how does that you discuss the fact that populist governments often lack the ability to deal with difficult crises. They don't seem to be able to do that well. And can you explain why they're not prepared to tackle some of those things? So I realize it's two things.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll start off with, you know, just a quick, you know, rough definition of populism. Because a populist government is one that basically short circuits a lot of processes. It's a style as much as anything else. So populism can occur on the left, on the right, in any context. You know, we've seen it in the United States over our history. Many countries have seen it. You know, and I would describe Vladimir Putin, you know, coming into the presidency in Russia in 1999 as perhaps the first populist president of a major country in the 21st century, because he comes in and says, I'm going to make Russia great again, and, you know, always find scapegoats for all of, you know, the problems that people are facing. I mean, the problems are complex. They're the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the efforts to undergo a very rapid privatization, you know, without really the kind of means to pull this off. And there's a whole, you know, series of issues that have to be explained. But, you know, really, populists are looking for simple solutions and simple reasons for, you know, why things have gone wrong in the first place. And so, you know, it's very easy to, in that case, divide people also into groups of us versus them. They're the ones that are causing, whoever they might be, all of the problems for you. You're the group that I am going to support here, and I'm going to, you know, basically try to make things better for you, and even, you know, to try to put things back. And when Putin comes in Russia, he actually appeals to all those old workers and the people who have lost their positions in the old manufacturing sector, and the people who used to be dependent on the state and who've now found themselves cut out of everything that's kind of happening and that seems to be benefiting people, particularly in Moscow, and then basically papering over the mass inequality that has arisen out of the privatization process in Russia with the advent of these oligarchs, the billionaires who are so far ahead of everyone else. And although some of the oligarchs get blamed for robbing the country, the people who are not politically loyal to Putin and who are, you know, kind of outside of his particular circle, there's also a lot of blame put on the United States and the West for trying to bring Russia down or keep Russia down on its knees. Now, of course, populism takes different forms in other places. As you said, in the United States, the developments here have been quite spotty. Some places do really well. I mean, you could look at Pennsylvania, as Caryn was talking about there as well. In the Lehigh Valley, you've got a whole cluster of universities. Sometimes with some universities do really well because the universities are very engaged in the town. You've still got some industry that has survived there. New industries might come in. Places like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, for example, have turned themselves around by lots of, you know, innovation by the city and regional government. But the next town over might not have done. And, you know, some of the factors are very specific. And people there, you know, feel that they have definitely been left out. There's often barriers for people to move. It's not that easy, as I describe in the book, for people to just get on and move to find another job. They may have family ties. They may be tethered, in fact, to a family home that they can't sell because nobody wants to buy it. Or the rental market may in another place be too much beyond their reach, or they just don't have information, you know, about other jobs. And it's that kind of sense of someone over here is doing well, but you're not, and what's the reason for it, that then provides the fertile ground for populism. In the United Kingdom, in my home area, for example, I mean, basically 50 years on, very little had changed. There was no industry left with the closing of the nationalized industries. There was some car factories came in from Nissan or Hitachi, some Japanese external investment. Usually investment was enticed in by the regional government with tax breaks. As soon as the tax breaks, say they were for 5 years, ended, the industry would move out again onto the next place. And so people were constantly feeling that they were being left behind. And the blame by successive governments was put on Brussels. That this was, it's very familiar here in the United States, was put on globalization and, jobs moving abroad. In this case, the whole idea was that money was being siphoned off by the European Union that could have otherwise been invested in the North. Immigrants were coming in from Europe after a certain particular period of time, Bulgarians and Romanians and Poles, and they were taking jobs in London. They certainly weren't moving into these areas because there was no work there. But the idea was that they were basically taking jobs that people in the North could have otherwise had. Because when I was, growing up in the 80s, before I kind of moved over to the United States, a lot of people were actually going to work on a temporary basis in London on construction and other projects, just as, we know is the case here in the United States. And in a way, remitting money, bringing money back from those jobs to the north of England, keeping their families there in the house there, staying temporarily in barracks like, or we'll call bedsit, kind of accommodation, but kind of coming back to home at weekends or after a few weeks. But those jobs started to dry up as the European Union free movement of labour really took hold. And look, and in part that was UK government policy because people wanted cheaper services. So again, similar pattern to what we see here in the United States. If you fast forward to 2016, my hometown voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, despite the fact that the only funding that was coming into the town was actually from the European Union for their regional assistance programs. And within 3 years after that, in the general election, the Labour Party, which had dominated the political scene for a full 100 years, was basically voted out in favour of the Conservatives. So basically for the very first time in the history of the constituency, because Boris Johnson had been campaigning on the slogan, let's get Brexit done, let's get out of the European Union, and then money, will come to you, and also on an anti-immigration platform. And of course, I don't have to explain to all of us that a very similar thing happened here in the United States. And in 2016, when you take a look at the results in the Electoral College, President Trump won by 70,000 votes roughly from 3 counties in 3 states, all of those being in counties which were a tipping point economically and also demographically. Demographics obviously has a part in this, but the underlining socio-economic dislocation was really the initial grounds for all of the problems that emerge out of this in terms of identity and cultural conflicts as well. Similar thing happened in the United Kingdom, and also, interestingly, in Russia, although it plays out in different formats there as well, but all in the same kind of time frame. Although each of the peculiarities were different, we got to a point in all of 3 countries where you had very similar populist upheavals, with everyone promising to make the country great again, and in many respects take certain groups that were the base of their support back to some past that seemed somehow more attractive than the present.
Thank you very much. And in interest of time, I'm going to go back to Caryn and let her ask another question. But that's a great explanation, and it clarified a number of issues. Thanks.
Right. It was wonderful. I do want to interject something new into it, which is to remind us that in 2016, President Trump ran against a woman. So I want to talk about ways in which the perpetuation of sexism and misogyny continues to influence our politics as well as personally. And Fiona, I'm 20 years older than you, but I also went to graduate school, taught and then worked in nonprofits. So what you had in your book about the way in which you had your gender defined pathways, promotions, and pay really resonated for me. And I have a daughter, 10 and 15 years younger than you, and I watch these recurring things happen to them. I wondered if you could share, on the one hand, some stories about how that happened to you in the midst of a distinguished career where you have all these accolades, you have made things, but how did you what helped you succeed? And is there advice you could give to younger or middle-aged or people about to testify, in their prime, about how to handle all of that hostility?
Yeah, well, there were several reasons why I wanted to put the theme of gender in. One of them is being a woman, and it actually does give you a certain perspective as you move through life. And it was extremely relevant when it came to actually doing my job as a Russia analyst, certainly with Trump, but also in Russia itself. And I felt like it was really worthwhile pointing this out, but also in the context of what I was talking about in terms of populism, loss of opportunity over time, and the sense of dislocation being left behind. Because a lot of people have tried to explain why is it that so many women have supported Trump, for example, or populists, or have been just as eager to vote for Brexit, for example, in the UK, or to support Putin. And there is, I think, kind of a current under this of a lot of women feeling left out because, they genuinely are out of the system, and feeling frustrated and angry. If somebody comes in and says they're going to be the champion, they'll give, them a try as well. In the case of Putin and Trump, although not everybody might think it, Trump, did tailor a message, to a particular, category of women, and Putin did it all the time. There was so much of his posturing and his, particular performance that was geared towards women of all kinds of ages. And I watched that in real time happening. It was pretty fascinating, kind of seeing the way that he would shift messages towards different constituencies. But there's also a way in which our inequality is exacerbated by inequality in women's pay and also minority pay. There is a very strong racial component. And I talk in the book about, although I obviously didn't experience it myself, I observed it very close, because I was struck by how in America, having escaped the class system in the United Kingdom, which had definitely kept me in a certain category in a box, I was immediately given an elevation on the fact of being white and British in the United States as soon as I came to the country. And it was immediately evident in the discrepancy when, I had friends who were African American at Harvard about how their treatment was very different from mine. But the major, point of inequality in pay is critical in terms of poverty and of exacerbating this over time. There's been so much research to show that on average, up until 2009, when the Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed, because of Lilly Ledbetter, the only female manager at an Alabama tire factory, who discovered just as about she's retired that for her entire career she'd been underpaid vis-a-vis the men, and that was going to affect her pension, that women are on average underpaid by about $20,000 vis-a-vis men, no matter whether they're in a blue collar or a white collar job, or a professional, or any other kind of employment, which is pretty striking, unless you're in a job or a particular sector of employment where there's a fixed salary. Now, I find it out the hard way, because ironically, in the United Kingdom, I never experienced it, because I always had jobs there. They weren't professional jobs, they were blue collar working class, jobs before I, moved to the United States, and they all had a fixed salary. When the job was advertised, the salary was advertised as well. I had no idea when I got into my first professional job that I was supposed to negotiate. When somebody offered me a salary, I took it. And it was only, after a period of time that I discovered that, whoa, I'd completely, lowballed myself. And I was already in my first job $20,000 below the salary of the guy who'd preceded me in the job behind. I hadn't negotiated, so, that was kind of partly my fault, but this, kind of kept on going, throughout the whole of my career to a certain point, until actually I joined the government, where things got actually rectified, because there was a clear, transparent level of salaries there, but not in the non-profit or the university world or many other sectors at all. And then when you think about the structure of our families, a lot of research that's been done by my colleagues at the Brookings Institution, for example, including Belle Sawhill, who's done a lot of work on children and families. The vast majority of single family homes in the United States are led by women, often, more often than not, minority women. And their discrepancy in pay, therefore, filters down to their children. And we have, a huge swathe of children in the United States. In absolute numbers, I think it's I know fair to say that it covers, every category of children, no matter what their racial background. Of course, proportionally, there are more black children living in poverty than there are white children. But if you look, kind of across the board, this is often related to the earning power of their mothers. And so this is, kind of knocking on it, and it sets generations off over time. And in my own case, my own family experience, actually, my mother made more than my father, which is very interesting because my mother was a nurse, and a nurse had a very fixed salary. And my father had been very well paid in the coal mines, I mean, relatively speaking. And as soon as he ended up working in the hospital, he was on the lowest rung of the economic ladder, because hospital porters, along with cleaners and cooks and grave diggers, were the lowest paid workers in the whole of the United Kingdom, so way below the minimum wage. And when my mother had to quit work to raise my sister and I, because there was no basically paid for childcare in the UK, we plunged way below the poverty line. So I experienced that on one parent's wage poverty for years, until I was sort of 12 or 13, when my mum went back to work again on a part-time basis. And so, I have experienced childhood poverty, and I know that, the impact that has. So I wanted to, from one point of view, to write about that, to highlight it, because it does fit into, these feelings of when you're left behind and you're in a place where it's very hard to get work. You're basically entrenching generations of poverty. And then it makes it more difficult to get ahead now, because since the 1980s, when I came to the United States, a lot of the grants and the subsidized education that I was able to take advantage of have disappeared. I mean, now there is much more of a thinking, once we've moved further away from the GI Bill and the Pell Grants, where we were thinking of education as lifting up all of society, of thinking about it since the late 1980s and more of an individual responsibility. And so people are more burdened by debt. We have that whole ongoing debate about educational debt. But we also are not really thinking about, I know Biden has been trying to do this with community college, vocational training, apprenticeships, how we can open up all kinds of educational opportunities for people, not just for university level, college level education, but across the board. And that is another element of, because that becomes the only real pathway out. We also know that most people who are faring worse in the economy is tied to their educational attainment. Whether you've finished high school or you've had some kind of additional further education, again, doesn't matter whether it's college, although 2-year college is really one of those cutoff points. So that's, again, why the Biden administration, and actually in the UK, they're thinking about this as well, about how to get people, this basic minimum of education for women in particular. That's pretty critical. But the other reason that I wanted to mention about being a woman was, I've found that in the environment of working for someone like Trump, who doesn't take women particularly seriously, apart from a very small handful, it was actually a problem being a woman, because I wasn't listened to. I wasn't given the time of day to get in there to actually, talk about the issues that were actually pertinent to policy. And it was actually my job. And being a woman was a liability, because it stopped you from being taken seriously. And in the case of Russia, that was even worse. I mean, there are plenty of women in politics in the UK, actually. I mean, having broken through now the barrier of having 2 female prime ministers, going from the Iron Lady then to Theresa May, who was a bit of an accidental prime minister. But there's still a heck of a lot of sexism and misogyny in the British system. And I think, you are right about basically saying that in the United States, a woman, I start to doubt that a woman will get elected as president, honestly, even though when you look around the rest of the world, we've had a female chancellor of Germany. I don't think there would be a problem, having another person. Angela Merkel didn't, spoil, the chancellery for another woman. I think, in the UK, it could very easily be another female prime minister. You look at the Scandinavian countries, their entire government are female. New Zealand and others, it's kind of like, there was a joke in one of the countries that had to have a quota for men because there were so few men in one of the country's cabinets. But in Russia, it's very hard also to imagine any woman anywhere in the system. And in fact, Putin used to take offense when women appeared in the US delegations. He thought that it was done deliberately to disrespect him. He actually said this and complained about it. And I've talked about it on many occasions that many of our interpreters and translators happen to be women, and sometimes that's even in itself a liability, because the way of translating men doesn't come across. I think sometimes some of our interactions are lost in translation simply by the gender and, the kind of appearance and perceptions of the actual interpreter and translator themselves. So there's one thing that I've just observed as a fact many times. And I talk a little bit about this if anybody's interested, because I think we have to think about it, particularly when we're in issues of war and peace and, crises like now, about how we interpret the situation, but also about how people like Putin react to women. So Putin loathed Hillary Clinton. It's one of the reasons that he interfered in the election in 2016. And there are only, a couple of prominent women in Russian politics. One is the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who is probably the best central banker there is. And, as a woman, it's kind of almost women's work in Russia's view. All of the accountants in the past in Russian factories used to be women. They're kind of seen as like they're holding the household purse. So this is the ultimate holding the household purse. And then the only other woman is the Speaker of the Parliament, Valentina Matvienko, who is in her 70s and has known Putin since back in the day in Leningrad. She's one of the boys. So she's not, I don't think they think of her as a woman, in all honesty. They think of her as one of them. And so, there is a complexity in that place, and that, there are no women anywhere, and there is very little diversity of view in Russia. And that itself becomes a major problem, because in all societies where you cut out voices, be they, on the basis of gender or race or socioeconomic background, disability, you name it, you're missing out on different perspectives. And those are pretty essential for any kind of policy making, or for really getting, a full picture of what's happening. I think part of the reason that Putin made this absolute and utter strategic blunder to invade in Ukraine is because he cuts out voices that are not like his. And he's in a kind of, self-perpetuating circle. And that's another reason, for writing about the gender aspect. Because, again, if you're cutting out 50% of your population or anybody on any kind of basis, you're causing a problem for yourself long term down the line.
Well, you touched on so many issues that Caryn, did you want to ask? Because I was going to ask one more and then wanted to go to the urban.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to ask one more, but then I think we ought to go to this.
Go to the question. And it was really related to the last thing you were talking about. And that is, given that you've written the definitive book on Putin and you've studied him for years, just very quickly, because this relates to a lot of questions we received. So, and the war is not, going as he had envisioned, obviously, the war in Ukraine. And sanctions seem to be having an impact on Russian people. What do you think is the best conceivable way, either for NATO to help Ukraine, or what do you think he's going to really want to do to save face? Because this is not a situation that, I think he had envisioned.
No, but Putin's goals won't have changed, unfortunately. There is no way that he's backing off, and I'm sure that everyone can see that anyway. Putin's not the kind of person to think that his aims were wrong in any way. What he'll just think is he's just going to, he's faced operational difficulties. And so, the subtitle of the book that I, co-wrote back in the day on Putin was Operative in the Kremlin. Because that's what he is. He's an operative. He's a guy who carries out a special operations. Why this is still called a special military operation. I mean, he's not a great strategist in terms of, von Clausewitz or a kind of a war strategist. He wasn't in the military. He was in the operations of dirty tricks. And he's often said that, no operation goes as planned, but as soon as you hit reality, things go wrong. And then you have to adapt. And that's what he's trying to do right now, as brutal and nasty as it is. And the Ukrainians recognize that. I mean, they've lived next door to this guy for all this time. It's 22 years he's been in power. He's not a surprise. And they've been in a state of war with Russia since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and the sparking off of war in Donbass. They know this is going to go on and on and on until somehow he can't go on any further. So the best thing to hope for, and this isn't particularly best, is that we can keep on supporting Ukraine because they have the will to fight politically and at the popular level. They have the ability to do so. They do have the manpower, but they need, basically the material, the equipment, the military material and financial support to keep on going. So that really becomes incumbent on us to stay the course as well. Because if you think about it, if there is a cessation of hostilities, Putin will have won in some respects. because he's reduced Ukraine to rubble. His war aim
Mhm.
was to dismember Ukraine, wipe it off the face of the earth. If it stops today, he, basically hostilities stop and we get a ceasefire. He's in control of whatever he's in control of right now in terms of rubble. And he's already gained more Ukrainian territory, and he will continue to keep the country on edge. So Putin's always going to win, no matter what.
Right.
Ukraine will lose itself. And so, kind of we have to be very careful that to keep on supporting Ukraine. I mean, the best case scenario is that we get back to the lines that Russia was in before February 24th, which is also very hard to envisage. And of course, that doesn't at all address the fact that the Russian military has laid waste to huge swathes of Ukrainian urban areas. Putin's minimum goals were to take over all of the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, because the Russian proxy forces were only in control for about a third of that up until February 24th, and he wants to take over the full region. That's where we're seeing all the fighting in Donetsk, Kramatorsk, and all these places that nobody'd heard of before, but are now on the papers every single day. He clearly wanted to take Kiev and topple the Zelensky government, and that will still be in Putin's mind. If he gets an opportunity, he'll go back and do that again. But the other minimal goal was taking places like Mariupol, Berdyansk, Mykolaiv, these other Melitopol, Kherson, all of these other cities and ports that go along the Sea of Azov and over to the top of Crimea, all the way down to Odessa. And he wants to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. That's why there's a blockade. And he wants to manipulate, this gets onto the whole issue of sanctions. He wants to manipulate the Western sanctions to say that we are the cause of all of the problems in food security, grain not getting out, that it's US sanctions and Western sanctions that are causing this. And he wants the rest of the world to pressure Ukraine to sue for peace and for the rest of us to give up as well. And over time, sanctions will have an impact on Russia. Not really immediately, but the sanctions that are constraining their ability to get components for the military, to be able to buy things. I mean, the Russian economy may look okay. Again, I've told you, Elvira Nabiullina, best central bank of the Ritz. If she can pull a rabbit out of a hat, she certainly will. But Russia won't be able to buy things. And it may be flush with revenue to the state from oil and gas, even if we get an oil embargo from Europe. Russia can sell oil to other parts of the world.
Right.
But if we can constrain their ability to buy things, they won't be able to substitute all of their imports, certainly not for high-level components for their industry and also for their military. So over time, it will bite. But right now, unfortunately, though, we don't really see any lack of Russian support. And I was on a call earlier before I joined this, where one of the commentators who was giving a briefing basically said on the Russian opinion polling, most Russians don't even want to know there's a war on. Because, basically, it's still called a special military operation for a very good reason. So then the vast majority of the Russian population can ignore it and just not find out information about it. And most of the soldiers who are being sent to fight, these conscripts that we're hearing about, and the contract forces are coming from the Russian Far East, from like places in the Caucasus and from Central Asia. I met with a friend from Tajikistan last week before the long weekend who said that there's very large casualties from the 201st Motorized Division that's usually based in Tajikistan that's been pulled out. And they have a lot of local recruitment of forces because Tajikistan allowed dual passports between Tajikistan and Russia. So anyone who has got a second Russian passport, in addition to being a Tajik or whatever, can be basically recruited. And because poverty is so acute in many of these places that are being picked up, people will take these jobs because their families will be given compensation if they die during the war. And so you're getting very low casualties from Moscow and St. Petersburg, some of the major cities. And so people can ignore this. So Putin's playing this very carefully and very cleverly. Because he thinks we're going to lose our resolve and that we're all going to fade away, and that people like Henry Kissinger, who, just to be very clear, Kissinger Associates did a lot of consulting for Russia, and Henry Kissinger's probably met with Putin more times than most people. So when Henry Kissinger says something, with all due respect to Dr. Kissinger as was, Dr. Kissinger most recently I have a chapter in the Mr. Putin book about, Putin's favorite German happens to be Henry Kissinger. He's also his favorite American. But, it's basically Putin has spent a lot of time courting Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger is, speaking really on behalf of, yes, a real, politique specialist, but also somebody who's thinking about, helping Putin to save face, not thinking about, what the implications are for Ukraine.
Well, this is kind of connected to, from our participants, connected to ways in which we could hold fast. And some of that is shifting the geopolitical dynamics with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and persuading more people to back sanctions, but like South Africa, Israel, and India. But do you see those as viable? I know Turkey is going to stand in the middle of that if they can.
Yeah, this is our dilemma. I mean, this is really what we have to focus on. It's exactly right as the question suggests. We know that we're not getting as much traction as we ought to be having in, the global South, Latin America, Asia. Russia's narrative holds there, but also, some of our own past transgressions are part of the problem. Yeah. There's a lot of resentment, rightly so, for the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. There was a lot of support for our, previous intervention in 1990 when Iraq had invaded Kuwait. But, fast forward to 2003, we blew right the way through that, as far as the Middle East and other, kind of countries are concerned. So, they're wondering, and Russians are saying to them, this isn't any different from Iraq. In 2003, it's very different, but they're managing to basically persuade other countries that this is no different from the Cold War period or from US interventions, that this is all the United States and NATO's fault, that this wouldn't have happened without them, and we've got plenty of voices in our own countries saying that as well. Well, in actual fact, what Russia was engaged in is a post-colonial neo-imperial land grab. Ukraine is its colony, and it's making it very clear in terms of the punishment that's being meted out on it, that Putin's talking about retaking territory. He's gone from saying that Ukrainians were, basically fraternal peoples to Ukraine's enemies and traitors, and he's trying to wipe them out. I mean, we've simply recently had a letter from a whole host of legal officials saying they see every sign of genocide being perpetrated now in Ukraine as well, on top of all of the war crimes, which are pretty evident to everyone and are now being documented. But this isn't getting traction, elsewhere. We're probably imperfect messengers for this. I do think actually Finland and Sweden joining NATO, if Turkey doesn't block it, and I'm in two minds as to whether Turkey's really going to try to block. Erdogan wants to wrest as many concessions as he can out of this, but he may also want to block them because he's kind of playing to crowds at home and to Russia and maybe to the global crowd as well. That he also wants to be part of this non-aligned movement, even if he still wants to be in NATO, which is kind of awkward fence to straddle. But this is Erdogan. He always managed to find a way of getting basically managing to do something like this, in my experience. When I was in the NSC, I had Turkey in my portfolio as well, and it was actually the most troublesome issue to deal with. Even putting Russia in there, it was always incredibly difficult. So it may well be that Turkey managed to block this, but Finland and Sweden can be very important advocates for this position about why things are different, especially with other countries. So, can many of our other partners and allies, you mentioned Israel. Israel can also, help us talking to other, countries, on a global basis. We have to really, I think, pull out all of the stops to engage in international diplomacy, to point out again how Russia is destabilizing the situation. It's Russia that's blockading Ukrainian grain through its blockade in the Black Sea. It's Russia that's messing about with talking about using tactical nuclear weapons and creating great instability in the strategic realm. It's Russia that invaded Ukraine. Irrespective of Ukraine's relationship with the European Union, NATO, or being completely neutral. Russia has had Ukraine in its crosshairs, as Putin has said over and over again. So we're just going to have to keep at it. I think we're going to have to keep at it in terms of discussing this among ourselves to keep our own resolve. And we are going to have to keep engaging with the Indias and the Chinas as well. I do think that China is having some disquiet about this. Perhaps not enough. They're very committed to their relationship with Russia right now. Xi won't want to see Putin fail because that will be on him as well. He'll have some responsibility for having partnered with Putin over this. So it's very difficult, but that's diplomacy. It's always going to be difficult. And I think we really have to keep focused on this.
Thank you so much. We're coming sort of close to the end of our hour. And this has been really wonderful, Fiona. We really thank you. But before we do come to a close, and Caryn will take us down to the very last moment, do you have a few final words of wisdom you want to leave with our participants?
Well, look, I think all of us can do something in all of the different circumstances we've been talking about. The problems that we have domestically now, we all have agency. I think, everyone here, particularly, where we are in Maryland and Montgomery County, one of the most diverse, places in the United States, with tight networks, tight neighborhoods. I mean, the fact that Chevy Chase and Bradley Hills, have groups like this is also important in itself. We can use our networks to do a lot of things, helping, persuade people to go out to vote, volunteering, with younger people, and, trying to help them find educational pathways, be it for college, but be it for vocational and other things as well. I'm actually using, just as a point, the advance from the book and any speaking fees I get I've set up a small charitable fund, and I'm starting to give the money away. To try to look for student hardship grants, internships, community colleges, vocational schools, whatever I can to, basically push forward some of the things I have in the back of the book there. But it also goes to the same thing for Ukraine and for the war. That, we can, help keep the resolve up. I know a lot of people are pushing to try to see if they can get Ukrainian refugees here. It's extraordinarily difficult with the visa issues, the same in the United Kingdom. We can see that Americans, writ large in public opinion polls, are very supportive of doing more and of keeping that support there. The problem tends to be at the political level. So I just wanted to, say, as I've learned throughout my life as well, that we've all got agency. But if we work together, particularly on a community basis and in our networks, there are all kinds of things that we can do to affect things, to affect change. The problem is when, we see the short circuiting of our politics, and everybody puts their faith in one person, because one person is never going to fix anything. And I've become, I have to say, somewhat disillusioned with organized politics, but I have not become disillusioned. I've never lost my faith in people power, in an organizations of people, and that's where a lot of the innovation and the thinking comes from. So we've got to, do the grassroots, the bottom up, and I think eventually then, we might get people at the top to follow along as well.
Well, for those who didn't read the book, in terms of agency, one of the groups that Fiona named are retirees. Now, I know not everybody in this call is a retiree, but that the villages are really about being able to become a retiree if you aren't one yet, and to be part of a sense of belonging in the communities you're with. So I think there are wonderful consequences for us to think about as villages, about what more we can do besides create this. We have a book group in Bradley Hills Village, and this will certainly be on my list when we pick our next titles and see if more people can benefit from that. But we have kind of three final words for you, Fiona, after your wonderful words to us in this book, and certainly in this Zoom meeting. First is admiration for your courage and your professional expertise and the integrity you've shown in public life, something that I have certainly come to appreciate. I thought it was the norm, and now I'm thinking it's like being impressed with a woman in Michigan who calls out, the lies. The second word is thankfulness for agreeing to spend your time when there's thousands of people asking for it, spending an hour with us here in the village. And the last was a deep gratitude for writing a book. And I want to encourage others to read it because it it offers such deep, positive vision of hope and a way forward. You had a better slogan than Biden did, I think, it's sort of moving forward together toward unity and equity and democracy. So that leaves us with only one last question. And this phrase came, question. And this came from one of our participants. Who will play Fiona Hill in the movie version of your book? And you get to think about that and perhaps imagine who that might be. And maybe we could do a raffle in the villages to decide. But with that, I just want to thank you so much on behalf of both of our villages for this exciting, dramatic, engrossing morning, and for your dedicated life to the well-being of all of us. So thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
No, well, thank you to everyone. I mean, it was just really wonderful being with you, and stay cool this afternoon. I unfortunately have to go and get changed and go down to Brookings, and I'm worried about melting.
Stay cool. Wear something cool. But we want the answer. You can email us the answer to the question.
I was thinking this sounds ridiculous. Brad Pitt.
Right. No, wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
No. We'll work on this.
I'll work on that. I'll have to think about it. Yeah. Dora the Explorer. She used to be my favorite cartoon when my daughter was small. I like Dora the Explorer.
Dora the Explorer. Wonderful.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much.
That was great. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks again.